People ask me sometimes how it started, like there's a clean answer, like I woke up one morning and decided to become whatever it is I am now. There isn't a clean answer. What there is a supply run gone wrong, a navigation system with apparently better ideas than me about where I should be flying, and a pair of Vascari military restraints that had no business coming apart the way they did. I'll tell it the way it actually happened, start to finish, and you can decide for yourself where the story really begins. I've never been able to pick the exact moment myself. I've had 11 years of hauling freight through the ugly corners of charted space, and by any reasonable measure, that week still ranks as one of the worst I'd had. It just didn't stay bad for the reasons I expected it to. It started with a delivery. Agricultural equipment, bound for the Thessic outer colonies, a route I'd flown at least 30 times without a single interesting thing happening on it. It kept going wrong through a navigation malfunction that dropped me out of a routine jump lane with no warning at all, straight into a stretch of space my threat assessment system flagged about 4 seconds too late as Vascari sovereign territory, unauthorized entry answered with lethal force. And it bottomed out in a Vascari military shipyard hangar, my hands cuffed behind my back, a ring of armed soldiers deciding what to do with me, and not one version of the truth I could give them that was going to sound better than my ship got confused. I didn't panic. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that came after. Panic costs you the one thing worth having in a bad spot, which is time to actually think, and I'd learned that lesson a long time before the Vascari ever laid hands on me. What I had instead, standing there with guns on me from 3 directions, was a slow, simmering, entirely undramatic irritation, the kind that comes from being reasonable in a situation that refuses to be reasonable back. The Vascari aren't cruel, not by nature. Militarized, proud, structured around a hierarchy so complete it apparently governs how their soldiers stand in a room, but not cruel for its own sake. I understood, in the abstract, why an unregistered freighter stumbling uninvited into a restricted shipyard might get detained for questioning. I understood it a lot less by the time I'd been cuffed, marched across an open hangar floor, and left standing for 40 minutes while 3 officers argued jurisdiction in a dialect my translator only half caught, throwing me looks now and then that suggested my continued existence was itself a procedural inconvenience. I was still standing there, weight shifted off one leg, trying to work the stiffness out of my shoulders as best I could with my wrists bound behind me, when the arguing stopped. Not gradually. All at once, the way it does when someone with real authority walks into a room. That was the first time I saw Carrie's Thal, though I didn't have her name yet, only the effect she had on a room full of soldiers who went rigid and silent the second she crossed the threshold. Tall. Taller than me by a clear head, pale-skinned in the way of a species built for a colder world than mine, platinum hair braided back in a pattern I'd later learn marked her rank. She wore her combat armor the way some people wear a jacket they've had a long time, comfortably, like it had seen worse days than this one and come through fine. Gray-blue eyes, and when they landed on me, I felt them do the specific math of someone deciding whether the problem in front of her was dangerous or just inconvenient. "You crossed into restricted territory," she said, her translator rendering it with a half-second lag that made every sentence feel like it was arriving from a little further away than she actually stood. "Explain yourself." "Navigation malfunction," I told her. "I know how that sounds. I'd love a better explanation, but that's genuinely the whole story. I was hauling agricultural equipment to the Thessic outer colonies and somewhere in the last jump my NAV system decided this was a more interesting place to be. I'm aware that's not much of an excuse. I promise you it's the true one." She studied me a long beat, the kind of silence built to see if a nervous man starts over-explaining. I didn't. Learned that lesson a long time ago too, in a different hangar, with different guns pointed at me. "Your ship's logs will confirm or deny that claim," she said. "They will," I agreed. "I'd appreciate somebody checking sooner rather than later. The cuffs are uncomfortable, and I've got a delivery deadline that's getting less realistic by the minute." Something crossed her face, not quite amusement, close enough to its neighborhood, before she put it away. You are very calm for a man in your position. I've been in worse positions, I said. Statistically speaking. This one's just inconvenient. The almost amusement disappeared entirely. That is an unwise thing to say to a Vascari officer. Probably, I said. I've been told I have poor judgment about when to be quiet. She turned to confer with one of her officers, low and clipped. In Vascari her translator settings apparently didn't think I needed to hear. And it was during that conversation, I've thought about the timing of it more times than I can count since, that the whole thing happened. I shifted my weight. The cuff bit into my wrist again, the 100th uncomfortable time in 40 minutes, and without any plan behind it at all, no calculation, nothing more sophisticated than a body that wanted its hands back, I pulled. I didn't expect anything to happen. I'd pulled against restraints before, in worse spots than that one, and the restraints had always won. These didn't. They shattered outward with a sound like a windowpane going all at once, a sharp crack and then a scatter of fragments across the hangar floor, a thin blue static charge crackling off the broken links and dying out. I stood there a second looking at my own free hands like they'd done something without asking me first. The whole hangar went dead quiet. Carries turned back from her conversation to find her human prisoner standing there with his wrists unbound, broken restraints scattered around his boots, wearing the exact look of a man who has just realized, mid-action, that what he was doing wasn't normal at all. That is not possible, she said. I agree, I said, raising both hands slow, palms out, which fooled precisely nobody given the circumstances. For the record, I didn't do anything unusual. I just pulled. I've been told Duralite restraints run about 4 times past what any known biological species can generate unassisted. So, genuinely, no idea. Her voice had lost every trace of its command flatness. What replaced it, for the first time since I'd met her, was uncertainty. No one breaks them, she said. Not Vascari. Not Drennick. No one. I'd like to point out, I said, careful, hands still up, that I'm not trying to escape. I'm standing right here. I just wanted to be a little more comfortable. The soldiers around us had gone rigid, weapons still up but plainly uncertain, waiting on a cue their commander hadn't given yet. Carries closed the distance instead, 3 unhurried steps, and lifted one hand halfway toward my wrist, not quite touching, frozen in the specific hesitation of somebody staring at a fact that doesn't fit anywhere in her understanding of how the universe works. What are you? She asked, quiet enough it barely cleared the hum of the hangar's air systems. A supply pilot with a navigation problem and, apparently, above-average grip strength, I said. I genuinely don't have a better answer than that. It took 6 hours after that. A full medical scan, 3 increasingly bewildered Vascari science officers, a confirmed cross-reference of my ship's logs, before the whole thing settled into something like calm. The navigation malfunction checked out. Cascading sensor fault, backed up in exhausting technical detail. The agricultural delivery checked out too, against a manifest that made the science officers lose interest in me for about 90 seconds before snapping right back. The strength stayed unexplained. One young officer with pale violet markings across her jaw made me squeeze a calibrated grip sensor 4 separate times, adjusting the upper threshold higher each round, watching the readout climb past it every single time with an expression that went, call by call, from professional curiosity to something closer to alarm. Carries walked me out to the hangar exit herself once I was cleared, which apparently was unusual enough that a couple of her officers traded a look about it before catching themselves. Your deadline, she said. Is it still realistic? Less than it was 3 hours ago, I said. But I've recalculated worse. I'm required to file a full report on this, she said. It will very likely bring further contact. Concord scientific interest, at minimum. Figured as much. I glanced over at her. At the composure that hadn't quite fully settled back since the cuffs broke. For what it's worth, Commander, this was still a better afternoon than I expected, given how it started. Something shifted in those gray-blue eyes. The command authority softened, just a little, into something more curious. More personal. "I have never," she said, "escorted a prisoner who improved his standing by breaking Vascari military equipment with his bare hands." "I have a talent for unconventional first impressions," I said. She studied me a moment longer, the way people study something they've already decided is worth remembering. "When the Concord scientists contact you, and they will, I intend to be present for that conversation." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it more than I let on. She walked me to my ship. The broken cuff stayed behind on the hangar floor, the first impossible thing either of us had seen that week, and very clearly, from the look she gave me before I climbed the ramp, not going to be the last thing connecting us either. At the foot of the ramp she stopped. "Try not to break anything else before the scientists arrive." I smiled. "No promises." For the first time since the cuffs shattered, she smiled back, brief, almost reluctant, but real. Then I boarded, she went back to her command, and somewhere in the space between us, an accidental border violation quietly turned into the start of something neither of us had planned for. The agricultural equipment arrived 3 days late. Everything else, it turned out, arrived exactly when it was supposed to. I didn't find out until much later what Carries did with the rest of that night, but she told me eventually, and it's worth telling here, because it's the part of the story where she stopped being just the commander who'd caught me and started being someone I actually thought about. She sat in front of a blank incident report for 40 minutes without typing a word, 19 years of Vascari service, and she'd never once done that before. It wasn't a lack of facts. It was that every version she drafted in her head sounded, to a review board, either insane or dishonest, and she'd never had to pick between those two before. Subject entered restricted territory due to a verified navigation malfunction. Subject was detained and restrained using standard-issue Duralite cuffs, rated to a tensile threshold 4 times beyond any known biological capability. Subject broke the restraints without tools, assistance, or apparent effort, while making idle conversation. She read that back 3 times, deleted it twice, and left it standing, because there was no way to phrase it that sounded less absurd than it had actually looked. She attached the medical scan, the grip strength readings that had simply run out of scale before my hand had, the flight logs that backed my story down to the millisecond. What she didn't add. Because there wasn't a field for it, and because she wasn't sure yet she trusted her own read, was the detail that mattered most to her, the look on my face right after the cuffs broke. Genuine surprise. A weapon doesn't look surprised by its own strength. A trained operative hiding his capabilities doesn't manage that kind of surprise convincingly either, not with 40 armed soldiers reacting in real time, and she'd spent 19 years learning to tell the difference. What she'd seen on me hadn't been performance. It had been a man discovering something about his own body in front of witnesses, with no preparation at all. She finished the report near midnight and sent it up the chain with a formal request that Concord Scientific be notified immediately, given the cross-jurisdictional nature of it and my status as a Concord-registered civilian. She didn't need to attach a personal note to a routine notification. She did it anyway, 3 careful lines at the bottom. Recommend Vascari liaison presence for any follow-up interview, given first contact circumstances and existing rapport established during detention. Volunteering for this role should it be approved. She sent it before she could talk herself out of how strange it looked, and didn't sleep much. 3 systems away, I was having a considerably less complicated evening, mostly because I'd decided somewhere around hour 2 after leaving Vascari space that thinking too hard about what happened in that hangar wasn't going to change what happened in that hangar, and I had a delivery to finish. I ran the numbers 4 times anyway. 4 times the tensile threshold of any known biological species, broken without trying, without bracing, without any sense at the time I was doing anything but relieving a cramp. That kind of number doesn't resolve itself by worrying about it alone in a cockpit at 2 in the morning ship time. It resolves through people with better equipment than I had, and I figured, correctly, as it turned out, that those people were already writing reports about me. I thought more than I expected to about the Vascari commander. Not about the strength question, which was objectively the bigger mystery, but about one small thing she'd said at the foot of that ramp: try not to break anything else before the scientists arrive, with a dryness that had genuinely surprised me from someone I'd spent 6 hours assuming ran entirely without a sense of humor. I didn't expect to hear from her again. I was wrong about that within the week. The summons came 4 days later, routed through 3 bureaucratic layers before it hit my ship in a format my comm system rendered, almost comically, as an official Concord Scientific Directorate notice of requested voluntary cooperation, which I understood, correctly, to mean come in, or we'll find a less voluntary way to ask. I went. There wasn't much of a decision in it. A man who could apparently break Duralite in a bad mood doesn't get to just decline follow-up questions, whatever careful phrasing the paperwork used about voluntariness. Besides, I was curious myself. 11 years hauling freight through the margins had taught me a healthy respect for not asking too many questions about things working in my favor. This felt, for the first time in a long while, like something actually worth understanding properly. The facility was a mid-sized Concord research station in neutral territory, 3 jumps from Vascari space, 2 from the nearest human settlement of any size, chosen, I figured, to keep the whole mess from turning into a Vascari versus Concord jurisdiction fight before anyone had answers worth fighting over. Carrie's was waiting in the docking bay when I came down the ramp, out of uniform for once, in neutral civilian clothes that made her look, I thought, both more approachable and somehow still unmistakably like someone used to giving orders. The station's warmer interior light did something to those gray-blue eyes I noticed and then, deliberately, filed away to think about later. "Commander," I said. "Mr. Kessler," she said. "I petitioned to be here. I want to be clear this wasn't assigned to me." I asked. "I appreciate that," I said, and meant it. "Though I have to ask, professional curiosity, or something else?" Something flickered behind her composure, there and gone. "Professional curiosity," she said. "For now." What followed stretched across 3 full days instead of the single afternoon I'd optimistically budgeted, and it started with exactly the kind of exhaustive baseline testing that made the grip sensor back in the Vascari hangar look like a parlor trick. Structural biologists mapped bone density that came back reading, according to the technician running the scan, at nearly triple the Concord median for a species my general mass. Cardiovascular specialists ran resistance tests that left 3 calibrated machines flashing overload before they found my actual ceiling. A quiet, careful geneticist named Dr. Vale spent most of one session just asking about my childhood, my diet, my family, with the patient thoroughness of someone building a picture one piece at a time instead of hunting for a single dramatic answer. "Your species entered the Concord 4 years ago," she said, on day 2, reviewing a data slate with the look of someone whose numbers refused to simplify. "Human registration with the Directorate is thin. Mostly trade data and immigration paperwork. Remarkably little formal biological survey work on file. Earth doesn't get a lot of scientific tourism," I told her. "Most Concord contact so far has been trade delegations and a couple of very polite diplomatic visits that mostly involved a lot of careful smiling. Why do you think that is?" I thought about it. Honestly, I think most species that meet us decide pretty fast they'd rather not look too closely. We're loud, we ask a lot of questions, and apparently, I turned my hand over, an unspoken nod at the last 4 days, we come with a few surprises nobody's bothered cataloging yet. Carrie's, sitting in on nearly every one of those sessions, made a note on her slate I didn't get to see, though I noticed she was writing down a lot more than the science team's actual questions seemed to require. By the end of day 3, the picture was consistent enough to draw a preliminary conclusion, and Dr. Vale delivered it in a small conference room with the careful, measured tone of somebody expecting disbelief. "Earth's gravity runs approximately 1.0 standard," she said. "The Concord median for worlds that produce sapient life is 0.6. We believe, preliminarily, this needs far more data, that human physiology reflects sustained evolutionary pressure under conditions considerably harsher than the galactic average. Bone density, muscular structure, cardiovascular resilience, all of it consistent with a species that developed under load most Concord worlds would find, over time, physically punishing. So I'm strong because I'm from a heavy planet, I said. That's the leading hypothesis. It doesn't fully explain the Duralite incident on its own. The numbers exceed what gravitational adaptation typically produces, even generously. There may be additional factors. Muscle fiber density beyond expectation, metabolic markers we haven't mapped yet. She set the slate down. We'd like your permission to continue this study, longer term, at a proper facility rather than a field station like this one. I glanced at Carrie's without quite meaning to, and found her watching me with something between professional interest and a question she hadn't asked yet. I've got a delivery business to run, I said. Can't disappear into a lab for 6 months. We understand, Dr. Vale said. We'd propose an ongoing arrangement. Periodic sessions, worked around your schedule. I thought about it. Thought, too, about the fact that whatever this turned out to be, it wasn't going away, that a man who could break Duralite by accident doesn't get to just go back to a quiet freight route and pretend the last week hadn't happened. All right, I said. Periodic. And I want the commander involved, if that's on the table. She's the reason I didn't spend last week in a Vascari holding cell wondering if I was about to get shot. Something shifted in Carrie's face, not quite a smile, but close enough that I noticed, and this time I didn't file it away for later. The agricultural equipment, 6 days later than promised, finally made it to the Thesic outer colonies, and I spent the next 2 weeks doing the thing I actually do for a living. Hauling freight along a modest, well-worn circuit that had never once, in 11 years, produced anything more dramatic than a late delivery or a difficult customs officer. It felt, for those 2 weeks, almost like my life had picked back up where it left off. Almost. The difference showed up in small places. I found myself, without quite deciding to, testing things, pressing my thumb into a stuck cargo latch that had beaten me for 3 years and watching it give on the first try. Lifting a crate I'd always needed a loading arm for, just to see, and standing there afterward turning the fact over in my hands like it belonged to someone else. I also found myself thinking, more than I expected, about Carrie's thal, the dry humor she rationed out so carefully, the particular focus in her eyes when she was actually listening instead of just processing for a report. We'd traded a handful of messages over those 2 weeks, brief and professional at first, then steadily, incrementally, less so. The message that ended the quiet stretch landed on a Tuesday, ship time, same channel as before, but with a flag I hadn't seen from them yet, priority, time sensitive. Mr. Kessler. A situation has developed near the Vascari-Concord border that the Directorate believes may be relevant to your ongoing study, and which requires immediate on-site cooperation from any available party with relevant capability. Commander Thal has specifically requested your presence, citing established rapport and operational trust. Details are classified pending arrival. Compensation and expenses will be covered in full. Dr. Vale. I read it twice, set my current run aside with the kind of reluctant professional guilt I reserve for genuinely unavoidable delays, and pointed my ship at the coordinates attached. I found Carrie's waiting on the landing platform of a Vascari border outpost 2 days later, out of the neutral civilian dress from the research station, back in full field armor, her expression set in the flat, focused calm I'd already learned meant something had gone seriously wrong. You said priority, I said, coming down the ramp. What happened? A mining outpost 11 hours from here went dark 6 hours ago, she said, no preamble, already turning to walk with me toward the command center. Full communications blackout, no distress signal, no response to hails. Standard protocol would treat that as an equipment failure and send a maintenance crew. We would have, if the outpost hadn't reported an unidentified vessel in its approach corridor 40 minutes before it went dark. Pirates? We don't know yet. The vessel doesn't match any registered signature in Vascari or Concord databases. There are 211 civilians on that outpost, Jonah. First time she'd used my given name without the surname attached, and I noted it even in the middle of the more urgent thing she just handed me. We're sending a response team. I want you on it. Why me? I'm a freight pilot, not a soldier. She stopped walking and turned to face me full on, something urgent and unguarded in her expression I hadn't seen from her before. Because 6 days ago you broke restraints rated for 4 times the strongest biological force we've ever documented, and I don't yet know what else that means you're capable of, and I would rather find out with you standing next to me than find out later I left capability on the table that could have saved lives. I held her gaze a long moment. All right, I said. Tell me what we know. We flew out together in a Vascari fast transport, a 6-person response team with Carries at the head and me occupying a seat that existed, on paper, purely as a scientific observer with no combat role whatsoever, a fiction everybody in that cabin understood, without saying so, to be exactly that. The 11-hour flight gave us more uninterrupted time together than the whole 2 weeks since the research station combined, and somewhere around hour 4, the conversation drifted, without either of us quite steering it there, away from mining outposts and unidentified vessels and into territory neither of us had made room for yet. You said, back in the hangar, you'd been in worse positions, she said, watching the star field scroll past the small viewport instead of looking at me, which I'd already learned was something she did when a question mattered to her more than she wanted to show. Statistically speaking, you said. What did you mean? I thought about how much to give her. 11 years hauling freight through the parts of charted space that don't see a lot of Concord patrol, I said. You pick up a few stories. Pirate boardings. A supply station that got hit by a plague outbreak while I was docked, couldn't leave for 3 weeks because of quarantine. A jump drive failure 2 years back that left me drifting for 11 days on air I'd rationed for 6. I shrugged, more weight in it than the casual delivery let on. None of it's dramatic if you're the one who lived through it. It's just Tuesday, until it isn't. 11 days, she said quietly. On rationed air. I made it work, I said. Turns out I'm reasonably good at making things work, even before anybody found out about the Duralite thing. She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its command register. On Vascar we have a concept. There isn't a clean translation, but the closest is something like the weight a person carries without asking anyone to notice. It's considered one of the highest qualities an officer can have. I did not expect to find it in a freight pilot who broke my restraints by accident. I looked at her, really looked, the way I hadn't quite let myself in the research station's fluorescent-lit rooms, and found her already looking back. For what it's worth, I said, I didn't expect to find it in a Vascari commander who apologized, in her own way, for arresting me. Something passed between us in the quiet of that cabin, brief and unclaimed and entirely unfinished, before the pilot's voice cut in over the comm announcing our approach to the outpost's outer perimeter, and by unspoken agreement we both put the moment carefully away to come back to later. The outpost, when we reached it, was exactly as dark as the reports promised, no running lights, no chatter, no response on any frequency. Embedded in the side of a modest asteroid, docking arms extended and unlit, the kind of stillness that read, to every trained eye on that transport, as something a lot worse than an equipment failure. Thermal scan, Carrie said, and the sensor operator ran it, painting a slow, grim picture. Heat signatures scattered through the interior, most clustered and unmoving, a handful showing the faint irregular signature of biological activity that read, unmistakably, as alive but restrained. They're not dead, the sensor operator said. Most are contained in what looks like the central processing bay. Life signs stable. Hostage situation, Carrie said, already moving for the weapons locker. Which means whoever's crewing that unidentified vessel is still aboard, holding the population, presumably for something they haven't gotten yet or they'd have left already. She looked at me. This changes the observer arrangement. I noticed, I said. The plan came together fast, built on her field experience and the team's standard breach protocol, a docking approach through a secondary maintenance airlock the hostiles were unlikely to be watching, a careful interior push toward the processing bay, minimal engagement until we'd confirmed numbers and positioning. It held for 11 minutes. It stopped holding when our point officer, moving ahead through a narrow maintenance corridor, tripped a security measure the outpost's original layout hadn't documented, something the hostiles had installed themselves, and the whole corridor lit up with alarm lighting, a klaxon shrieking through the outpost's metal bones. "Contact," Carey said, weapon already up, voice flat and fast. "Fall back to the junction, defensive positions, now." The first hostile came around the bend before she finished the sentence, weapon already firing, and the careful, methodical plan dissolved in about 4 seconds into the kind of close-quarters chaos no plan survives intact. I was unarmed by design, standing where the formation had put me, behind the point officer, ahead of the rear guard, and I found myself, in the sudden compressed violence of that corridor, doing the only thing available. Moving forward instead of back, closing the 4 meters to the first hostile before he could swing his aim off the point officer and onto anyone else. I didn't make a decision about it, not one I remember. I remember the weight of his weapon arm under my hand, the strange, unfamiliar feeling of putting force into another person's body and meeting almost no resistance at all, his shocked exhale as the weapon came free of his grip easier than a toy taken off a kid. I remember Carey's voice, sharp and urgent behind me, and the rest of it resolving itself in under a minute, 3 disarmed hostiles, one of our own with a minor shoulder wound, and a silence that dropped across that narrow corridor almost as fast as the alarm had broken it. Carey's reached me first, weapon still up, eyes scanning past me for more threats before settling, fully, on my face. "Are you hurt?" "No," I said, looking down at my own hands again. Second time in 2 weeks I'd caught myself doing exactly that. I don't think I even hit him that hard. "You took a plasma-rated weapon out of a trained hostile's hands in under a second," she said. "I need you to understand that isn't a small thing, Jonah, even by the standard we've already set for you." "Understood," I said. "Can we get the rest of these people out first, and I'll have my crisis about it later?" Something that was almost a laugh, entirely wrong for the moment and entirely genuine, escaped her before she caught it. "Yes," she said. "Later. Move." The remaining 8 hostiles, the team's count, once we'd secured the corridor and pushed toward the central processing bay, turned out to belong to an unregistered raiding crew running out of the Reach's less patrolled fringe, drawn to the outpost not for the miners but for a shipment of refined ore sitting in the bays holding containers, valuable enough on the gray markets past Concord space to be worth the risk this far from real support. They hadn't expected resistance. Mining outposts this far out rarely carry defense capability worth a raider's concern, and the 211 civilians huddled zip-tied along the back wall of that bay had, until the corridor alarm went off, represented nothing more to them than a manageable inconvenience to keep quiet until the ore transfer finished. The breach into the bay itself was, by any measure, the most dangerous stretch of the whole operation. 8 remaining hostiles, armed and fully alerted, against 5 of us plus 1 supply pilot whose combat classification remained, on paper, entirely undefined. I spent most of it doing what I'd later described to Dr. Vale, in a debrief I dreaded and needed in roughly equal measure, as getting between people and getting weapons out of hands, a description that undersells, considerably, what the response team actually watched me do. Absorbing weapon fire that would have dropped any of them without slowing me more than a stumble. Closing distances in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Disarming hostiles with a controlled, almost gentle economy that left them stunned and unharmed instead of dead, because, and this was the part Carey's kept coming back to for days afterward. Even in the compressed, adrenaline-soaked chaos of a live firefight, I hadn't killed a single one of them, when killing would have been, by every standard she'd trained under, both faster and safer. The last hostile went down with his weapon crushed, quite literally, in my bare hand, the casing folding like paper instead of reinforced alloy, and then the bay was quiet except for 211 civilians beginning, in ragged, disbelieving waves, to understand they were going to survive the day after all. Carries found me afterward standing near the holding containers, looking at my own hands again. The ritual she'd already started to recognize, the private reckoning of a man discovering his own edges in public, one crisis at a time. "You didn't kill any of them," she said. "Not a question." "Didn't need to," I said. "Once I had the weapon, they weren't a threat anymore. Seemed unnecessary to do that to somebody. Most people, in that situation, don't have the luxury of that calculation," she said. "Adrenaline doesn't usually leave room for it." "Maybe not most people," I said. "I don't know what I am anymore, Carries. 2 weeks ago I was a freight pilot with a bad sense of direction. Now I don't know what the ceiling is." She looked at me a long moment, the bay's warning lights still washing intermittent red across both our faces, the sound of civilians being freed and reunited with each other rising gently behind us. "I don't know either," she said. "But I intend to find out with you, if you'll let me." The formal debrief ran 3 days, split between the Vascari command structure Carries answered to and the Concord Scientific Directorate, who by the time we got back had upgraded my classification from voluntary cooperating civilian to something the paperwork called, with a flatness that made me laugh out loud the first time I read it, asset of unprecedented category, ongoing monitoring required. Dar. Vale's follow-up testing, run against the fresh data from the outpost, produced numbers that made her earlier hypothesis look, in her own words, conservative to the point of irrelevance. Whatever baseline strength Earth's gravity alone might explain, the outpost numbers blew past it by a margin nobody on the science team had a ready explanation for. Something, she suspected, that had less to do with raw physical baseline and more to do with what happened to that baseline under the specific pressure of an active, immediate threat to other people's lives. "There's a phrase in some of the older human military writing we've managed to source," she told me, near the end of the 3rd day, reviewing the outpost data with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything. "Adrenal override. The theory is that human physiology, under sufficiently high-stakes threat, can access reserves of strength and pain tolerance well beyond normal operating baseline, a kind of emergency capability most humans, historically, only accessed once or twice in a lifetime, under exactly the kind of pressure you were under in that corridor. So I'm stronger when people are in danger," I said. "Preliminarily," she said. "It's a hypothesis. But it would explain the gap between your baseline testing here and what the response team documented at the outpost. It would also," she chose her next words carefully, "explain why Commander Thal specifically requested you for that mission, rather than simply hoping the mystery strength from the hangar might turn out useful in a general sense." I glanced across the debrief room to where Carrie stood reviewing her own portion of the report, and found, not for the first time, that she was already watching me. I didn't say anything about it in that room. Neither did she. But that evening, on the research station's quiet observation deck, looking out at a star field neither of us had any particular reason to be watching except each other, the conversation we'd left unfinished on the transport 11 days earlier finally got where it was going. "I filed a follow-up request," she said, no preamble, watching the stars instead of me, the same tell I'd already learned to read. "To remain assigned as Vascari liaison to your ongoing study. Long-term. Professional curiosity?" I asked, handing her own words back to her, 3 weeks and 1 firefight later. "No," she said, and finally looked at me. "Not anymore."